Hello and welcome to Orkney Aviation Festival and its opening day, the theme of which is sustainable aviation. And the topic is led off by a look at the Sustainable Aviation Test Environment, SATE. Orkney is known for its work in marine energy, but rapidly Kirkwall Airport is becoming the centre of developments, exciting and world-leading developments in sustainable aviation. Our speaker, Professor Andrew Rae, is particularly appropriate. In fact, his background reads almost like a story of the aviation industry over the past 30 years. He worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. He was working there on wind tunnel corrections and test techniques. He's worked on the clearance of flight test aircraft, a whole range of aircraft which are now familiar. He's visiting professor at Surrey and Zhengzhou University in China, and he's based at Perth College in the University of the Highlands and Islands, where he's professor of engineering. Well, good afternoon, Andrew, and welcome. And we're looking forward to hearing from you about the sustainable aviation work that's going on at Kirkwall Airport and across Orkney.
Thank you very much, Howie. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to send apologies right from the word go. This introduction was supposed to be given by David Holden from Highlands and Islands Airports, but he's had to be called away to another meeting, so I've stepped into his rather large shoes, and hopefully will do a good job of the sort of things he was going to say. But some of you will have heard me talk about SATE previously. It's been going for nearly 3 years now, and is a large consortium of partners, many of whom are based in Scotland, but it's across the UK, and we've had some international partners as well, and their logos are at the bottom of the screen on this slide here. So as Howie said, Orkney has been the perfect place to create this test environment because it's been an early adopter of technology, marine, as Howie said, but also various forms of energy, and the transport network is ripe for the evaluation of these types of aviation as part of a multimodal transport network that involves decarbonising road and rail and air services. So without further ado, next slide, please. So the idea behind the SATE project, which is funded through UK Research and Innovation through their Future Flight Challenge programme, is to create the UK's first operationally based low carbon aviation test centre. There are other test and evaluation centres in the UK, but they are much more restricted in who and what can fly within them. So to do this sort of thing at an operational airport is unique within the UK. And Kirkwall is perfect because it has all of the things that a very busy airport does. So it has scheduled airline services, it has helicopter movements, it has general aviation, it has a full air traffic control service and terminal operations. But obviously the airspace and the number of movements of aircraft is smaller than you'd get at Heathrow. So it gives us space to play with these new types of technology without disrupting the normal operations of the airports and their operators. So the idea was to create this environment where various technologies could be demonstrated. And obviously the aircraft are the most visible part of that, but there's also a whole load of underpinning technologies that enable those aircraft to fly, which includes the physical infrastructure at the airports, so electrical charging for batteries and hydrogen refueling for hydrogen aircraft. And even in the 3 years that SATE has been operational, the sector has moved on leaps and bounds, and a lot of the people who were startups at the beginning of our program are now increasingly well funded, and especially those that have demonstrated success in their chosen technology. And you may remember from a couple of years ago, Ampere's aircraft flew between Wick and Kirkwall several times, and Wind Racers did some freight carrying activities for the Royal Mail on some inter-island routes within Orkney. So we're getting to a point where some of these technologies now are approaching commercial operation, and that's really the ambition of this current phase of the SATE program. So Future Flight Challenge was split up into 3 initial phases. The first one was a short 6-month phase that enabled people to get together and to form consortia. And the first phase of the project kicked off in November 2020 for 18 months. And then this current third phase began in the summer of last year. So as I said, a lot of the technology development has resulted in significant physical demonstrations. And the next step is to enable those demonstrations to lead to commercial operation. An example of that being hub and spoke type activities, whereby small autonomous aircraft can disperse freight or other payloads to smaller communities. And that's where Orkney is perfect, because you have the main airport at Kirkwall that then feeds into the council airports on some of the islands, and then from there we can distribute freight to other areas. And it has to be said that Orkney Island Council has been superb in its support for the programme. It's helped us identify use cases, and it clearly sees the need and the benefits from some of these operations. But the main purpose behind all of this really was to decarbonise aviation. So the Scottish Government has set out a target to decarbonise aviation within the Highlands and Islands by 2040, and that's ahead of the UK government target. And that's what led Highlands and Islands airports to advance this project and to be the lead partner within it. And as I mentioned before, the aircraft are the visible part of it, but we need to supply them with fuel. And there's no point having decarbonised aircraft if that energy is not itself green and sustainable. And that's where Orkney is a perfect place to do this, because it has an abundance and a variety of different ways that we can generate and deliver that energy. So the infrastructure is important. So some of you will have seen the SATE hangar at Kirkwall Airport and the associated offices. That hangar has electrical charging points for electric aircraft, and is intended to have an electrolyzer to refuel hydrogen aircraft, but also looking at sustainable aviation fuel, which is a replacement for current kerosene, which is the jet fuel that the bigger airliners use, but it's grown from low carbon alternatives to fossil fuel, and aligns with, as I said, the UK and the Scottish Government strategic priorities for both decarbonisation and for improving accessibility to communication and to travel within the remoter and rural areas of our country. That's important both for access to things like healthcare and support for businesses, but also challenges the way that we currently do things. So if these aircraft operate with different economics and different possibilities, we can start to introduce new centres of aviation. If you don't require a mile of runway, you can do things that currently aren't possible. So I think that's on that slide. Next slide, please. So this slide describes some of the partners within the consortium and some of the use cases that we've got. So as I mentioned, the lead partner is Highlands Islands Airports. As you know, they operate most of the main airports in the north of Scotland. And they are also, crucially, the air navigation service providers. So they look after the air traffic control. So it's very useful having both the airports and the airspace controlled by the same company, and that company being involved in looking at better ways to do things. So I helped co-create the project many moons ago as the academic partner within the consortium, and we have several platform partners, the platforms being the aircraft themselves. So previously we had ZeroAvia and Ampere in the first part of the program, and now we've added to those with different types of aircraft, and I'll talk about those a bit more in a minute. But Arc Aerosystems have got an interesting eVTOL aircraft. It's a multi-rotor aircraft, but also looking towards a gyrocopter type aircraft, which is a really good way of approaching short takeoff and landing under existing aircraft design regulations. So each of the aircraft that fly commercially have to be designed to a set of certification standards, and those certification standards don't exist for things like hydrogen and electric aircraft at the moment. They do exist for gyrocopters, so ARC are using existing frameworks to design their aircraft, and therefore will have a much smoother ride to entry into service than some of the more exotic aircraft that are being considered at the moment. So hybrid air vehicles have developed the Airlander, which is a large lighter than air aircraft, massive payload, and excellent capability for landing pretty much anywhere on water, on land, providing the infrastructure is there. And Cormorant is a Dutch company developing a seaplane, and Windrace, as most of you be familiar with their excellent autonomous aircraft that can deliver a 100-kilogram payload over a range of 1,000 nautical miles, and made the headlines recently by landing their aircraft on one of the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers. So we think that's the first time an autonomous aircraft has landed on an aircraft carrier, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that when Yvette talks about wind races later on this afternoon. So as I mentioned previously, the infrastructure is key to all of this. There's no point having the aircraft if they're not supported properly. So EMEC will be familiar to those of you in Orkney as a sponsor and developer and tester of marine renewable devices. They've been involved in the aerospace sector for a while as part of the hydrogen fuel generation and refueling activity. They've worked with Zero Avia on a couple of projects and bring that expertise to our project as well. Hytrans is looking at that multimodal aspect. So how do we incorporate aviation into the existing public transport network and using airports to supply energy, for example. The Connected Places Catapult is looking at passenger journeys, where people want to go to, how often they go there, how long do they spend there. And that work will enable us, in conjunction with the university, to understand what a future route network should look like. At the moment, as I said, we're constrained by where runways are. If that was no longer a constraint, what could we do? And obviously Loganair is the incumbent scheduled airline, providing services to the islands and around the islands. And they are a significant partner within the project, bringing their operational expertise and knowledge of what's needed from a customer of these aircraft on the routes that they serve. And Arcadis are looking at the exploitation of, yes, this is really good, interesting work, but how do we exploit it in terms of commercialization and benefits to the communities that we're looking at? And Flarebright, in the previous phase of the project, they flew a little drone that's used originally to take photographs in emergency situations, but they're now developing flight control systems in GPS denied areas. So they're looking at flight control systems and machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I've mentioned already Orkney Island Council, who have been a brilliant supporter of the project. They're not officially part of the consortium, but have given us a massive amount of information about what they need from aviation and the operational side of it. And they've been joined by Shetland Islands Council and Highland Council in giving that view, and the Western Isles too. And HIE, as the regional development agency, have helped us look at business cases and use cases as well. And Adlershaw Goddard are a law firm, and so there are some legal aspects of this which is really important to consider. So the whole project really was predicated on use cases. There's no point having some snazzy technology flying around if it's not serving a purpose. So some of the people have given us information on what they would like to do with these capabilities are listed underneath there and under end users. So I've already mentioned Royal Mail and the medical side of things with the NHS, but there are also logistics and environmental aspects that need to be addressed. So Streamline, probably aware, is a logistics company that serves the northeast of Scotland. Nature Scott is looking at things like water quality and delivering samples. And then there's more the sort of business activity. So how do you get goods from one place to another more quickly and more easily, especially if it has a short shelf life, like seafood, for example. And then the assets that we've got, the bottom left is it's an old computer generation of what is now a reality at Kirkwall Airport, the Sate hangar, which has serviced several aircraft as part of the project, including Windracer's UAV, which is pictured second from left there next to the Royal Mail van. Zero Avia sadly have had to pull out of the program because the complexity of bringing their aircraft to the far north has proven to take more time and more cost than they had originally planned. So their aircraft is currently flying at Kemble in Gloucestershire. And even if we don't see it as part of this program, we hope to see it as part of the follow-on program. But the truck on the right side there is the mobile refueler that EMEC have helped develop, which will be used for Zero Avia and for other hydrogen-based aircraft as part of the project. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned most of these already. Windracer's top left will be familiar to those of you who've tracked the project over the time it's been running. Next to that is Airlander's HAV's large Airlander vehicle, which starts at a 7-ton payload and goes up possibly to a 70-ton. So that the capability of that aircraft is immense, and it has generated significant interest with airlines around the world who want to use it in a different way to conventional cargo aircraft. Now, ARC have two pictures on here. The bottom left is an eVTOL drone, and the top right is the gyrocopter that I mentioned previously. So the top right one is the one that's a really clever approach to the market because it already has a certification route defined by the Civil Aviation Authority. The trouble with eVTOL aircraft is if the rotors stop, they take on the aerodynamics of a brick and it drops quite quickly, whereas a gyrocopter, helicopters and gyrocopters do a thing called auto-rotate, so if the engine fails, the rotor keeps turning and generates lift. So the pilot has a choice of where he can land rather than just plummeting earthwards. So it circumvents a lot of the safety problems associated with multi-rotor drones. I've mentioned Zero Avia already, and then we have two seaplane operators, designers, sorry. One is Cormorant, that I've mentioned, the Dutch company, and then Warrior in the middle right-hand side there, a similar, but perhaps more conventional type of seaplane. And then brilliantly, from my perspective, because my grandfather flew for Ted Fresson many years ago, the Project Fresson Hydrogen Islander project is joining SATE, and so that's Cranfield Aerospace and Britten Norman themselves. That aircraft is under construction at the moment and hopefully has a first flight in the next year or 18 months. And it'd be fantastic to see that aircraft fly in Orkney. Next slide, please. So not all of those platform developers are going to fly something. Quite a few of them are looking at the possibilities of what their platform could do. So some of the outputs from the project have been scoping and concept of operations. So ConOps is concept of operations. How and what services would these aircraft be able to perform within our region, especially in and around the islands? So again, there's another picture of Airlander's, HAV's Airlander aircraft over Kirkwall, and ARC have looked at similar possibilities for a route network. So that's where the analysis of passenger travel, who goes from where to where, how long does it take them, how often do they go, how long do they stay, informs where these operations should happen in the future. And Project Heart there is something that HILE are involved in. and it's a large autonomous freight delivery aircraft, again originally based on the Britten-Norman Islander. It's fantastic seeing what is now nearly a 70-year-old aircraft being at the forefront of a lot of these developments. I don't think Mr. Britton or Mr. Norman would have ever foreseen it being at the heart of the next stage of aircraft development. Next slide, please. Oh, I've not seen the next slide yet. Oh, is that the end of the presentation? Oh, there we go. Right. Okay. So mentioned the flying between Wick and Kirkwall that Ampere did, and that route is the blue dotted line on the map here. And Wind Racers did flights between Wick and Kirkwall around Orkney, and then up to Tingwall and Unst in Shetland and to Fair Isle. And they will be extending that route network within the current phase of the project, which was due to have happened this summer, but due to delays with approvals from the Civil Aviation Authority, that may not happen now until later in the year. But again, Yvette will talk to you more about that later in this afternoon. And Ampere's aircraft, which I was very familiar. One of the highlights of my career was getting the permission for that aircraft to fly. So it's a hybrid electric aircraft, the front engine of which was replaced by an electric motor, and the big gondola underneath the fuselage there is the battery. And so that made headlines not just in the UK, but around the World Aviation Week is the large US magazine. It's equivalent to Flight International, and we made the cover of that. And we had a PR event in August 2021. So you can see the aircraft parked at Kirkwall Airport, just outside the fire station, an event we had then. So I think that's on that screen. Next slide, please.
That is all the slides I've got. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Right. So apologies. That's trying to talk to somebody else's slides. You don't know when they're going to end necessarily. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Now, there's several questions that really sprang into my mind. And the first one was, we read a lot about the problems in aviation, about the amount of carbon aviation generates. From what you say, though, it does look as if the researchers and the companies in the aviation sector are really working very hard to solve the problems. And there's a whole series of potential solutions on the way to be tried out.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, in my 35-year career, we've always been trying to make aircraft more efficient. In some senses, that means trying to make more money for the airline. So the more or the less fuel you burn, the less it costs you to fly. But we're now doing it for a completely different reason. And there is no silver bullet. There's no magic wand you can wave that suddenly decarbonizes aviation. So the range of technologies we're looking at are suited to different activities. So battery electric will always, at the moment, be limited to short range aircraft because the batteries are heavy. Hydrogen is an attractive option, but there are challenges with hydrogen. It's a very small molecule, so it will leak from pretty much anything. So how you manage that leakage and getting the hydrogen in the first place it's one of the most abundant molecules in the galaxy, but very little of it is in gaseous form. So we need to generate hydrogen sufficient quantities and at sufficient cost to make it attractive. And then for long haul at the moment, the only viable option is replacing kerosene, jet fuel, with sustainable aviation fuel. So it's horses for courses. But yes, when I talk in schools, I say to those that are interested in an aviation career that if they get to the stage in their career that I'm at the moment, I hope they laugh at me, because they'll have come up, I hope, with a much better way of doing this, but we've got to start somewhere.
It looks also as if you and the various developers are not only finding ways to replace carbon producing fuels with more sustainable alternatives. It does seem that fresh ideas are developing with potential to actually improve the transport network generally in the Highlands and Islands.
Absolutely, yes. That's one of the most exciting parts about this is improving connectivity and access to connectivity for people. I won't go into the ferry saga at the moment, but it's familiar to most of us. But there are better ways of doing this. So generally, we look at ways of either doing things more cheaply or more safely, or doing things we couldn't previously do. And it's one of those rare occasions where it might actually be all three of those. So we can do it more safely, more cheaply, and enable services that currently aren't possible.
The ferries is really interesting about marine transport, because it does seem to me that roll-on, roll-off ferries are an extremely complicated way of taking people and goods from A to B, because you put the people and goods into buses or cars or lorries, you put the lorries onto the ferries have to have terminals. Now, of course, for passengers, we've got, for nearly 70 years, 60 or 70 years, that a simple and faster alternative in the Islander aircraft. Big problem has always been freight, but looking, for instance, at that airship, could we be within sight of some local freight solutions?
I think so, and that's definitely what hybrid air vehicles are looking at. If time is not a problem, and on short distances, then it won't be a problem, because the Airlander flies relatively slowly, but it can carry a massive payload and it can go anywhere. So that there are definite options around freight. You're absolutely right. Things like the inter-island timetables aren't predicated on things that are useful to most people. It's getting teachers to the schools or pupils to the schools. So having that flexibility is a real bonus. Even when my grandfather was flying in the 1930s, they could fly when the ferries weren't running, because you'd get a 15-minute weather window. The aircraft could fly and get to its destination, and then the weather would come down again, whereas the ferry was stuck on the dock waiting for the sea state to drop.
And something like that airship, for instance, would indeed not only it could take heavy goods, heavy items, I guess, not only vehicles, tractors, farm machinery between an island and Kirkwall, but it could also make much simpler freight between one island and a neighboring island.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the larger version of the aircraft can carry 70 tons, which is a mind-boggling amount of freight. So probably more than you'd want to carry between the islands on a regular basis, but certainly it opens up options that don't currently exist. The real trick is the weather, and that's another reason why Kirkwood has been a perfect place to do it. It has a challenging geographical and meteorological environment. So if you can make it work here, it can make it work pretty much anywhere. So there is an upper limit on any aircraft. It's not just airships and other lighter than air aircraft. So there's a crosswind limit for any aircraft, and you'll be painfully familiar with the amount of times that the air services from Kirkwood have been stopped because the wind's in the wrong direction, or the HAR comes down. So yes, there are significant weather challenges, but that's one of the things that people are focusing on just because of where we are.
It could also open the way then for new routes, for instance, in the Highlands and Islands, because at the moment, if you want, for instance, to send freight from Orkney, say, to the Western Isles, well, there's a lot of sea journeys and a lot of road to drive on in the middle.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm keen on is in some respects, the islands are quite well served. So to get from the central belt to Kirkwall or to Stornoway is relatively easy, but to get to somewhere like Thurso or Dunnes or Ullapool can be tricky. It's especially if one of the roads is closed for some reason. It's a massive detour. So these littoral communities, as well as the island ones, could benefit from services that don't need a runway to land on.
And just one more question. The various companies here are research and development. They're very much in the production and development of new types of air transport. Are there also operating companies that would potentially be interested in taking up some of these new ideas if they prove to be successful?
Absolutely, and Loganair is one of those. That they aim to be flying the first zero carbon flight in the UK on a regular basis. But that's what I meant by the commercialization of these services. So setting up companies that run these alternative services using alternative aircraft is the next step. And in some cases, that's the developer themselves, and in others, it's companies that see the potential and will buy the aircraft to operate for themselves.
Andrew, this is fascinating. And I should mention, just before I round off and thank you, that tomorrow, indeed, you'll be back to join us at 2:00 to celebrate the 90th anniversary of civil aviation services in Scotland and the first flight between Inverness and Kirkwall by Highland Airways on the 8th of May, 1933. And it would be rather wonderful on this 90th anniversary to think that we may be within sight of new services and new types of service. We'll be back at 3:30 when Yvette Lawrenson of Windracers tells us more about the work, indeed, that Andrew mentioned just then. I should say also 4:30, Skiff Dobney of ARC Aerosystems will be talking about advanced air mobility. But in the meantime, Andrew, that was fascinating. And at times when sometimes there are people that tear their hair out just about when transport problems come up. Rather exciting indeed to think that there may be some new solutions on the way. Andrew, thank you very much indeed, and goodbye for now.
My pleasure. Thank you.